a fixed hip waist ratio, slightly less than their own, that women want to mate with men with Rolex watches because these indicate their status and power and capacity to provide for them in the economic world in which we live, that we are equipped in our brains with a whole set of modules which enable us to detect cheats, to change up, to detect who our kin are, to behave in particular sorts of ways. In fact, the claim of evolutionary psychology, the leaders of the evolutionary psychology developments over the course of the last 10 or 20 years, have claimed that our brains and our behavior and our minds are like, they say, Swiss Army knives. And by that they say, you all know Swiss Army knives, they've got gadgets for corkscrews, for saws, for scissors, for taking stones out of horses' hooves and all these other sorts of things. What's more, Cosmides and Tooby, the two psychologists who've made this claim, insist that humans are born innately with, if you like, small Swiss Army knives in our brains, and as we grow, the Swiss Army knives get bigger and bigger and bigger, but nonetheless, these are the fixed modules of our minds which are shaped in the Pleistocene and shape, in fact, the way in which we behave now. So we have a fixed way of behaving. We are fixedly gay or lesbian. We are fixedly committed to living in a capitalist society. We are fixedly racist, not because we have genes which make us racist, or not because actually we believe that people who come from a different ethnic group from ourselves are innately inferior, but because our genes and our evolutionary past make us only capable of bonding with and working with a small group of people, our kin and those people immediately around us. And anyone who is not part of that group is part of an out-group, and therefore people to be dismissed. And so it's our genes which make us, if you like, nationalists, chauvinists, xenophobic, and so on. These are the sorts of claims which come out of evolutionary psychology. And of course, the claim that they end up with is essentially the claim of Voltaire's Dr. Pangloss. And that is the world we live in, a world which is racist, a world which is sexist, a world which is class divided, a world which organizes itself along capitalist lines. A world of this sort may not be the best world that we can imagine, but it's the best world that we can possibly achieve, because our evolutionary history will not enable us to achieve anything better than that. And that is ultimately the claim of evolutionary psychology. We may not like it, but that's what we've got to live with. Now, what I want to insist is, despite the popularity of these evolutionary claims, they do not bear biological or social thinking and analysis for one moment. And they do not do so, firstly, because they insist that there has not been evolutionary time in the 160,000 years since humans came down from the trees, in order to make the changes, in order to make different sorts of society. That's not true. Evolution proceeds very, very rapidly indeed. A very good example of just how evolution proceeds rapidly is to look at the number of people in this room, and I guess it's most of you as adults, who are capable of drinking milk. Have a quick show of hands. Who's capable of drinking milk here? Overwhelmingly you are. But if you asked a similar number of people in Japan or China, or certainly if you'd asked our evolutionary forebears in Africa, then almost no adult would be capable of drinking milk. Why? Because the enzymes which are needed to digest milk, which you have as an infant when you're suckling, are shut down very quickly in most mammals, and indeed in humans, so far as we know, in their original state. And it's only with the development of agriculture and the development of domestication of animals which provide milk, like cows, sheep, goats, and so on, that in fact there was a co-evolution of the capacity of human adults in those sorts of agricultural societies to actually be able to digest milk as adults. That's a very simple genetic evolutionary change over the period since the Pleistocene. And of course there are many more as well. Changes in brain size, many, many other changes in the ways that we are. Irrespective of looking at changes in society and changes in culture. But then, of course, we don't know how our human ancestors behaved in the Pleistocene. We've no idea at all. We have a few shards of bones and skulls from which you produce a huge account. And if you read, I've said this before, I'll say it again, if you read the accounts given by the evolutionary psychologists of how they actually sort of believed our ancestors behaved in the Pleistocene, or you go to look at the museums and the dioramas of our Stone Age ancestors, what do you see? You see man the hunter coming in with some carcass over his shoulder, woman the gatherer sort of making a fire or tending children at her breast and chipping away at bits of food and so on, as if, in fact, our Pleistocene ancestors lived in the sort of nuclear family. I call this Flintstone psychology because the view is somehow they're exactly like the Flintstone view of life in bourgeois families in California in the 1950s. We do not know this, and those dioramas sort of fantasize about the way our ancestors behaved. So we don't know how they behaved, but we do know there's been rapid evolutionary change. And furthermore, we know also that the crucial thing about being human is not shaped primarily by our genes. And let me tell you exactly what I mean by this. I've said before that our closest living genetic neighbors are chimpanzees and the closely related bonobo species of chimpanzees. You and I and everyone in this room is 98.4% identical genetically to chimpanzees and bonobos. If you think that's a lot, you'll also remember you're 30% identical to daffodils and cabbages. But just take the chimpanzees for a moment. Just let's talk about the chimpanzees at the moment. No one would mistake anyone in this room for a chimpanzee, and no one would mistake a chimpanzee for one of us. So the difference, that 98.4% genetic similarity, the 1.6% difference between us, which accounts, for those of you who know some biology, for a few hundred base pair substitutions, a few hundred amino acid substitutions in the proteins which make up you and me and our chimpanzee cousins, cannot account for the huge differences between us and them. And this is accounted for by the regulatory processes, by the developmental processes through which we, as our chimpanzee cousins, develop over that long developmental period that we have as well. The regulatory processes, the complexities of living as an organism in a society which actually sort of means that our brains develop slowly after birth, is such as to create the differences between us and the chimpanzees. And of course genetics are part of it, but they're only part of it. In order to add to the statement that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, you have to say nothing in who we are as humans makes sense except in the light of our development, the long period of development of child and of our psychological development. And furthermore, and essentially, because we are social animals, because we live in societies, because over the course of the last 160,000 years or so, our culture, our society, our technologies have been transformed by human activity, then nothing in who we are now can be made sense of except in terms of the society in which we live, the technology which we live in, the cultures that we have got. We are essentially, and this is where I think the insights of Marx and Engels become very important in actually understanding that in order to understand both that we live in, we are materialists, that we actually have to understand there is one world in which we exist. But we have to understand that what creates us in that world is a dialectical relationship between our genes, our environment, our social context in which we grow and develop. We're not dealing here, if I want to talk about it in formal philosophical terms, with the mechanical materialism which Marx and Engels were so critical of. We are dealing with a dialectical materialism, a way of understanding the developmental processes out of which we create who we are, out of the raw materials of